Hey, welcome to Behind the Beet. Today we're going over some Prince drum patterns. Every pattern that we do today is created with samples from the Lin LM1. These are pretty easy to find. Just load them into your favorite sampler. Prince used these same sounds for over a decade, and the way he kept them fresh is by manipulating them and running them through effects. So we'll go over some of the things that he did to keep these sounds interesting. So let's start with a really simple one. This is Let's Pretend We're Married from 1999. In this pattern, we have a very fast tempo. It's 185, but the basic pattern is really simple. It's kicks on 1 and 3, and then snares on 2 and 4. But that snare has very heavy delay, so it's almost like a double hit. And then he uses the auxiliary percussion, in this case a clap and a tom, to keep things fresh. That clap is tuned down almost an octave, and the tom is tuned up about a minor third. So something you'll notice as we go through these patterns is that Prince tends to stagger his auxiliary percussion. So at first we have the clap accentuating the beginning of the pattern, and then we have the tom accentuating the end, filling in space between the kick and snare. In this, the snare is tuned up a fifth, and the kick is tuned down almost an octave. As we go through, you'll notice that he tends to switch this up. Sometimes he'll tune the snare up and the kick down. Sometimes both are up, sometimes both are down. So for the next pattern, let's get a little more complex. This is from The Beautiful Ones from Purple Rain. So here the basic pattern is again very simple. The kick and snare both tuned down. Just go. But now we have 4 pieces of auxiliary percussion. We have the crash, which lands right on the downbeat. And then again, he staggers the auxiliary percussion. So in the first measure, you have the clap. And then in the second measure, there's a trade-off between the shaker and the toms. So the first half of the measure, the shaker is playing, and then the second half, the toms come in with a fill. And that fill brings us back to the beginning of the measure. It's also worth noting the delay on that clap. And then another thing you'll notice in the following patterns is that everything is soaked in reverb. So now let's get even more complicated. Here is Delirious, also from 1999. So here our kick is tuned up, our snare is tuned down. We again have 4 pieces of auxiliary percussion. So here we have the shaker, the clap, tambourine, and then a rim. The down-tuned rim shot is a very common sound in Prince tracks. They call it the door knock. Sometimes he'll detune it by an octave plus. In this, it's only down-tuned a fifth, and it has some delay applied. On the other hand, the tambourine in this track is almost an octave down. So the basic pattern, again, very simple. We have a double time feel, so the kick is on 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the snare is on every upbeat. And then we have shaker, clap, rim, and then the tambourine. One thing you'll notice is that there's no hi-hat. So whereas most drum programmers would lean on the hi-hat to keep time, Prince instead leans on his auxiliary percussion. And let's see the basic pattern do most of the timekeeping. Here our shaker is functioning kind of as a hi-hat would. And again, we have staggering going on, so we have the clap filling in the and of 1 and 3, and then the rim kind of plays around it in the second measure of the pattern. So now let's move on to something more effects heavy. This is When Doves Cry. Our basic pattern is again very simple. It's just our snare is tuned slightly up, our kick is spot on. But what you'll notice on the kick is this kind of high-end shimmer. That's created by running a high-passed version of the kick into a reverb. This creates an effect where the high end outlives that lower transient. That same reverb is also on the snare, but it's not as noticeable because the snare is already pretty high frequency. Here we have 5 pieces of auxiliary percussion, including our first appearance of a hi-hat. Other than that, we have a tom, a clap, that down-tuned rim shot, so the door knock, and then a bongo. So that bongo is just doubling the snare. Now let's drop the bongo and bring it back. It adds kind of an interesting hollow airiness to that snare. The clap with delay on it doubles every third snare. And then the other auxiliary percussion is doing that same staggering. So the rim shot or the door knock fills in the first half of the measure, and then the hi-hat fills in the second half. And meanwhile, underneath we have this descending tom fill. So let's hear the interplay between the rim shot and the hi-hat. We'll leave the kick in for timing. Now let's add it all back. And there it is. For our final pattern, we're going to do probably the most complicated. This is a Ballad of Dorothy Parker from Sign of the Times. So our basic pattern, again, simple as ever. The snare is tuned way up, almost to like a piccolo snare sound. The kick is tuned slightly down and has that same reverb halo effect. Here we have 3 pieces of auxiliary percussion. We have the door knock, a tom, and then a hi-hat. The rim and the tom do the same interplay thing we've been seeing, but only on measure 2. So the rim will come in the first half of the measure, and then the tom will fill in the second half. Meanwhile, the hi-hat is just filling in 1/8 notes. So let's hear it. And then at the end of the 4th measure, there's a snare fill in 1/16. But then after that snare fill is where things get really interesting, because Prince ramps up the complexity of his hi-hat. So for the most part, it's just 1/16. Those landing on a downbeat or on an 1/8 note, they're a little longer. Those landing in between are shorter. So here's what it sounds like on its own. And then we have these open hats accenting things every now and then. It's important to note that he's attentive to the choking effect, where you have a closed hat cutting off an open hat. So in the first half of the measure, towards the end, when the open hats come in, he drops the 1/16 in between them. But then in the second half, the 1/16 come back and choke the open hat. And then the open hats enter that interplay between the rim and the tom, so they kind of play in between that existing arrangement. The main takeaway for me is that it's okay to have a simple kick and snare pattern, and that it's more important to add variation using your auxiliary percussion. Manipulate and affect your individual drums, so detune, pitch up, pitch down, add effects, add that high-pass reverb to the kick. You don't need 1,000 snare samples, you can do a lot with just one. The elevated role of the hi-hat as a timekeeper is maybe undeserved. You don't really need that timekeeping if you have an interesting pattern in your auxiliary percussion. Which brings us to the next takeaway. Use a lot of auxiliary percussion. It's extremely useful. Stagger the patterns so that they don't interfere with each other, but definitely make use of them. It's better to have a simple rhythm spread out across a few voices than to have a really complex pattern that's just hi-hat. If your hi-hat is taking center stage, vary the decay so that it has a little bit of life to it. And then just cover everything in reverb. These are just my takeaways from these 5 patterns. I'm sure there's a lot more to learn from his body of work. But for now, this has been Behind the Beet. Thanks for watching.